Well, it looks like most of you remained in your seats, so we may as well get started to maximise the amount of time we have for conversation. My name's Melinda Harvey. I'm the convener of Critical Matters, and I'm also... Oh, thank you, Ben. It's not over yet. And I'm also a reviewer. I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Many of you, I know, are reviewers or have a very active or professional interest in the book reviewing scene. So I am very grateful to you for you coming along on a Thursday afternoon at a weird time to discuss criticism with us. This panel is called it's called Making Criticism Matter, and it's not called Does Criticism Matter, or even Why Does Criticism Matter? To paraphrase one of my favourite critics, Elizabeth Hardwick, criticism, analysis, reflection is a natural response to the existence in the world of works of art. And without it, works of art would appear in a vacuum. It would be as if they had no relation to the minds experiencing them. It would be a dismal, unthinkable world with these shooting stars arousing no comment and leaving no trace. In fact, I didn't paraphrase her, I just quoted her. So criticism, the right to make, and the need to make criticism are clear, I think. That everybody can make criticism these days proves, not disproves, that it matters, I think. But that doesn't mean we can't turn our minds to the idea of how we make criticism matter, how we make it matter even more. To help us discuss that idea, I have 5 of my favourite critics in the room to do that. So introducing them, they're not sitting in order, so this is going to confuse me, but I'll do my best. We have Delia Faulkner, Peter Rose, Karen Goldsworthy, James Lee and Geordie Williamson. I'll introduce them in a more fulsome fashion individually. So Delia Faulkner is the author of 2 works of fiction, as I'm sure you all know, The Service of Clouds and The Lost Thoughts of Soldiers, and the non-fiction memoir Cultural History, Sydney. She has been reviewing various books since 1994 and has had her reviews published in the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Australian Book Review. So I'm going to hand over to Delia now.
Thank you. Is Australian book reviewing particularly awful? Are Australian book reviewers a particularly untalented bunch? In 2010, in the journal Kill Your Darlings, journalist Gideon Hay launched a damning spray. The books pages of Australian newspapers and magazines have become such a wasteland, he wrote, that traditional timidities no longer suffice as a satisfactory explanation. Sections that should contain some of a publication's sharpest, shrewdest, most incisive and irreverent writing have become hodgepodges of conventional wisdom and middlebrow editorial. In 2013, introducing anonymous reviewing in the Saturday paper, editor Eric Jensen, or is it Jensen? I'm not sure, argued that it would mitigate against a, quote, certain timidity afflicting the broadsheet papers. In July 2014, in a much criticised piece in The Conversation, on the Conversation website, UTS lecturer John Dale began with this opener: "It is generally acknowledged that the standard of book reviewing in Australia is poor." Also my colleague, we had a couple of interesting discussions in the corridor about that. Australian reviewers, John lamented, failed to follow John Updike's rules for great reviewing, while Australia has never produced its own James Wood. More on that subject later. In 2001, in a more proactive move, academic Ben Etherington initiated an occasional Critic Watch column for Sydney Review of Books, edited by James Lee here. In 2013, it would be akin to ABC's Media Watch to counter our, quote, lukewarm, tame reviewing. Now, you don't need to go far, unfortunately, to find these narratives of decline, or rather I would probably say narratives of lament or even narratives of self-flagellation. each marked by what we might call an Australian exceptionalism. Not only does Australian reviewing have issues, but the issues that are here are worse. It's more constrained, it's more gullible, it's of poorer quality than anywhere else. It's also rare for any of these perennial criticisms to point out any positive achievements by Australian reviewers. And of course, reviewing for newspapers and elsewhere, I do have to say that it's often dispiriting, to say the least, to work in an environment in which you are constantly being told all reviewers' work is, not to put too fine a point on it, crap. But today I want to subject these criticisms to a little of the same kind of critical process I'd bring to a book. That is to think about their tone, their language, their assumptions and context, because my theory is that they blind us to some of the more important questions we could be asking about reviewing in Australia, but also elsewhere. So first, I just want to dispense very quickly with some of the factual assumptions that tend to come with these sorts of laments. It's often assumed by John, for example, for John Dale and Gideon Hay, that newspapers and journals like the Times Literary Supplement, LRB, Los Angeles Review of Books, New York Times, etc., pay more for reviews than Australian publications, and hence attract dud reviewers. We attract dud reviewers. Now, those magazines don't, with the exception of, say, the New Yorker, which is a very high payer. In fact, one of the journals on that list I've just read you doesn't pay at all. Then there's the argument running through these articles that are seen as smaller than others, and hence good or honestly critical reviewers don't step up. Yet a study of English reviews, which I read a long time ago and couldn't source for this paper, noted that the large majority of reviewers in major British papers and journals had gone to the same small handful of schools. So we might be small, but arguably our reviewing culture is less class-bound, and I think there's another stat that came up in one of the papers this morning that there tends to be a narrower range of publishers within the British review magazines as well. Is Australian reviewing unusually timid or tepid? Well, it's true that you're less likely to see a hatchet job here than elsewhere, although Peter Craven, who was on the last panel, has produced a couple of spectacularly negative, excellent negative reviews, so we do not lack them. But on the other hand, Australian reviewers often seem to me to be endowed with more of the useful qualities of doubt, modesty, and even wonder about writing than some of our overseas counterparts. I'd say from my experience of being reviewed, though, that if we're going to say one thing is particularly good overseas, I'd say American reviewers are particularly excellent at putting a book into its historical and literary context. But these exceptionalist laments seem to me still to be grounded, perhaps even in the old Australian cultural cringe. I don't want to go there, but I do just want to say that my issue is not that I don't feel that we lack problems in our reviewing sphere. I'm not a Pollyanna, but I think that my beef is with this idea that we have, ours are worse or more spectacular or more peculiar just to Australia than anywhere else. In contrast to the doomsayers, I'm not full of the same gloom, although I'm certainly the first to be critical of a review's shortcoming, as my friends will know. So it strikes me that the Australian reviewing scene's actually been unusually sprightly over the last 5 years, and that seems to have been something that's been coming up a little bit again in discussions here. Yes, there are issues facing newspapers in particular, but that's not just in Australia, that's globally. Falling circulations and advertising mean reviewers' rates have been falling. I'm earning 30 to 50% less per word than I did in 1994, just to put that in perspective. And yes, the review pages in newspapers are reduced. And there's content sharing and a whole lot of other issues that are problematic. So materially, yes, it's certainly a bad time to be a reviewer, but age and experience have taught me that there's always, no matter what, there'll always be brilliant younger minds in love with their subject that continue to rise no matter what, and some of them are here today. And the fact is that here in Australia, we've seen a rise of exciting new venues outside the newspapers. For example, the Sydney Review of Books, the Sydney Ideas series at Sydney Uni, which is sponsoring 1-hour lectures on Australian literature, the Wheeler Centre's Cal-subsidised Longview series of commissioned essays on Australian literature, new publications like Anne Summers Reports, which pays very, very well, and so we need to, and if we need to judge by overseas standards, then I would say that the relatively new Sydney Review of Books actually does give us something in the same ballpark as America's Book Forum or the Los Angeles Review of Books, if we have to, make these sort of national comparisons. The other thing I think that often happens in these laments is that we tend to never mention what excellent reviewing and we do have. And just off the top of my head, I sat and I thought, well, what are some pieces that I have thought have been examples of reviewing excellence recently? These would include Sam Twyford-Moore's very fine and very early analysis of Teju Cole and the intersection of his work with Twitter and the novel in Meanjin. Karen Goldsworthy on Robert Dessay in the Sydney Review of Books recently. Felicity Plunkett's very beautiful analysis in a very short amount of space on Sarah Waters in the Sydney Morning Herald recently. Tegan Bennett Daylight on George Saunders. Justin Clemens on Franco Moretti in the Sydney Review of Books. And that's just off the top of my head. And if we extend the idea of what constitutes reviewing, we might take in, say, Coetzee's essays on writing or Brenda Walker's bibliography reading by moonlight. So there are an awful lot of good critics in Australia at it at the moment. But we don't have a James Wood. Well, I suppose that's true, but what does this mean? And do we want one? And John Dale isn't the only person who wishes that we did. Wood's often raised as the alternative to the state of reviewing here, and his name's come up a couple of times already today. And although Wood is an excellent reviewer, it does seem to me that his reviews constitute a very particular genre of review. Perhaps one that's embedded at the centre of old publishing power, a bit more of the old publishing centres, but a form of reviewing that's perhaps fading globally in the face of edgier, more personal reviewing styles. Yeah, I think we're yet to see that, but certainly what Wood brings to the reviewing table, along with a remarkable sensitivity to a text, which I do love, is a great, almost evangelical certainty about what good literature is. Which, as I've written myself of his work, it does tend to favour books that are naturalistic, his great heroes Flaubert, while he's often tone deaf to the strategic or contemporary uses of the novel. But I can't help suspecting that what Wood symbolises for so many critics of our Australian reviewing culture is most people's image of what a critic should look like. That is, a man. He puts the wood into the image of reviewing, so to speak. So I could not help myself. So this suspicion was unfortunately stoked by Stephen Remay's December 27, 2014 column. Stephen's the literary editor of The Australian, in response to John Dale's column in which he elicited readers' thoughts on the state of our reviewing and responses to the reviews he'd run. Now, this is, I'm not critiquing Stephen's writing, I'm critiquing what came in to Stephen. I can't say there wasn't a single woman mentioned. There was one single woman in a full page of The Australian. And here is one response from a retired male reader. Or a male reader, retired perhaps. Over time, I've noted that some of the writers were better than others, and so I remembered their names. People like Geordie Williamson, Louis Nowra, Michael Bodie, Peter Craven, even Gideon Hay, and oddly, James Bradley. And that's thought-provoking, but we continue. And of course, the reader continued. He would also include Graham Blundell, David Stratner, and Christopher Allen. And it was the same story from both male and female respondents, I want to make clear. And it's fascinating to me that there was not a single, in this discussion, and often discussions today, we're rarely hearing female reviewers as benchmarks of good reviewing, whereas I would think Zadie Smith, Jenny Diskey, Marina Warner, or perhaps the late, great Angela Carter, whom I would back against James Wood any day, might be worthy of mention. But perhaps the rather dispiriting answer to why those female names aren't coming up is that no matter how well a woman writes a review, as soon as we start to think of reviewing in the abstract sense, perhaps women drop out of the picture. This is a provocation. So as a critic trained to read critically, I can't help wondering if there's something else going on in our narratives of lament, especially the most recent. A nostalgia for a passing print culture, certainly. All are fixated on the newspapers. Perhaps also by inference the power granted to the reviewer. And I think in the lament against timidity, I can't help wondering if that if there is something about a loss of manly values that are supposed to go with a particular type of reviewing, fierce, argument, combativeness, etc. And sometimes I think that the Platonic image of a critic at work in these discussions seems to be a throwback longing to some sort of imagined robust all-male culture of the 18th century coffee house. So just to speak very briefly about how I think this obscures things, I want to turn very briefly to Ben Etherington's debut Critic Watch column for the Sydney Review of Books. His first test case was the uncritical reception to Anna Funder's All That I Am, in his view, middle-brow Nazi airport fiction. Now, in this review piece, and I'm sorry to take it apart, Ben, if you're here, but... Great, hi. I do think that the argument made is that reviewers, the judges of the Miles Franklin were taken in by the golden glow around the book from these sort of timid reviews. And I just can't help wondering if instead of taking the exceptionalist route to looking at a particular moment, a particular book, there are other ways of looking at a book like something like Funder's novel, and that would be to place it within an international market for global literary fiction, in which we have lots of other books in the same constellation, like Anthony Murray's Constellation of Vital Phenomena. Emmett Stinson's done something similarly, taken this sort of tack in an interesting and provocative article about an international style in successful Australian fiction. While Malcolm Knox some years ago criticised literary prizes like the Miles Franklin for supposedly turning towards rewarding middle-brow novels. These seem to me more productive approaches than the genre of lament as it stands, placing the blame on mediocre Australian critics and focusing in specifically on critics. So my provocation then is to suggest that we spend more time pulling focus back from questions about the quality of Australian reviewing, especially in newspapers, to some broader and I hope more productive questions about how we can strengthen our reviewing culture and reviewing culture generally. That one might be to question the idea of reviewing needing to be combative or to go home, which I thought Mireille did so beautifully in her paper just now. Another might be to be a little bit more self-conscious about gender, not only in terms of the gender of books reviewed, which we have been focusing on a bit more positively lately, I think, in Australia, but queering the assumptions we make about reviewing that may be gendered. This idea of timidity, for example, I can't help feeling is perhaps gendered. This isn't only something at stake for us as critics, but I think especially for our gatekeepers. And again, because I want to take that focus off looking at Australian reviewers specifically, I think that, some approaches to this might be to make sure that when we have panel sessions or interviews on the radio or elsewhere about reviewing, we think of female reviewers to act as chairs or to be discussants, as we have here. I suggest too that maybe we could be a little bit more respectful of female audiences and what we assume they want, given that, as we've discussed, the majority audience is often female. I prefer not to be briefed when I'm on radio that I'm to imagine the audience is Aunt Mabel at home and dumb down my critique accordingly, as happened quite recently. Aunt Mabel, in my experience, not as recently as a couple of days ago, I just want to point out. But Aunt Mabel, in my experience, wants to know about politics and postmodernism. Thank you very much. I think perhaps there is a diminishment of criticality across the board and across the industry, perhaps particularly more in the great social club that's Twitter. But I think that we need to look at forces far beyond any individual critic's control, and in particular we have to be careful that the fear or perception that we have poor critics doesn't lead us more and more to promoting a lack of criticality in our media and our festivals, and trying to find people other than reviewers or not let reviewers rip. It seems amazing to me that we'll listen to Krauss, the physicist, talk brilliantly about physics, but we don't create that same space for someone to talk for an hour.
Those aggressive pitches require a great deal of time-consuming and firm resistance from busy editors who aren't interested. Susan Wyndham says there's a lot of presumption among some reviewers that if they get in first with the pitch, I hate that word, she says, then the book is theirs, and I will be persuaded that we should cover it. I spend a lot of time now telling people I don't want to review a certain book, or that I'd like to think about my choice of reviewer. So to conclude, although my title might suggest the contrary, I'm not actually arguing that the pitch ought to be totally ditched. What I am arguing is that it should remain an optional way, one among several, of generating content, rather than becoming a norm in which the fastest, loudest and hardest pitches will determine the contents of the reviews pages, because frankly, I can't think of anything worse.
You didn't bring that little book with you, did you, to Melbourne? Looked like Peter's got one of those little books by the expression on your face. Peter Rose is our next speaker. He has published 5 poetry collections, 2 novels, and was awarded the National Biography Award in 2003 for his family memoir, The Rose Boys. Peter is editor of Australian Book Review, and I hope you all got your free copy of the magazine as you came in. If you didn't, perhaps Amy will hand you one on your way out. I'll hand over to Peter.
Thank you, Melinda, and congratulations on a really exceptional conference, a most enjoyable one, I think, for all participants. Now, after so much elevation and provocation, I'm going to be sordid and talk about money, particularly with reference to young writers, young reviewers, the future of Australian letters, if I can put it like that. Like all literary editors, I am frequently approached by young writers and reviewers looking for work, not often with pitches, and I would certainly never accept a pitch from a newcomer, someone I didn't know. I always try to meet these hopefuls if they live in Melbourne, and in about 40 to 50% of cases, I pretty promptly offer them a book for review, often starting out with what we call an in-brief, which is a 300-worder, to see how it goes. That is, if they avoid addressing me as Hi Pete in the first email, they've got a pretty good chance of getting work from us. As Peter Craven said, you get it by doing it. And in my experience, reviewing, which I came to late, only at the behest of my predecessor, Helen Daniel, is as long an apprenticeship as poetry. It is an art, after all. 2 things often strike me during these interviews, which I always enjoy. First, no one ever raises the subject of money. I attribute this to Anglo-niceness and good old Australian discretion. Such is the reticence that I now make it clear at the outset that ABR pays for everything it publishes, print or online. This shouldn't be exceptional, but it is. My visitors' surprise is palpable. Then I tell them our base rates, what they will earn for their first review. Our rates, by the way, have quadrupled during my time as editor, admittedly from a very low base. Happily, they have doubled in the past 2 years. Now we pay at least 40 cents a word, and often we pay considerably more than that. I register a second kind of shock when my younger aspirants tell me how rare it is to be paid and how rarely the subject arises. In recent times, several bright young reviewers have talked about their dealings with wealthy online publications, I won't name them, that never mention a fee, or, if the debutant is bold enough to ask, reassure them that they hope to be able to pay them down the track at their 2nd or 3rd or 4th attempt, and so it goes. At first I found this hard to believe. Now I realise it is a trend in some quarters, and one that surely amounts to gross exploitation. As I was researching this paper, a seriously bright young critic who writes for me, a young man who has educated himself for the better part of 20 years, gaining several degrees, including an Oxford PhD, told me about the fees he has recently been offered, sometimes after many reminders to these organisations. He wrote a 2,000-word article on his specialty, the Sermons of John Donne, which you might expect might have required a certain amount of homework, 2,000-worder, and was paid £100. The New York Times, arguably the greatest newspaper in the world, pays 50 cents a word. After many emails and months, the LA Review of Books paid him $100 American for a 1,600-word review. That is less than 10 cents a word. Let me give you an example from my own experience. It is about poetry, but I think it is illustrative. A few years ago, an academic publisher sought permission to reproduce a poem of mine in an anthology. It was flattering, if one allows oneself to be flattered by such things. No fee was mentioned. I was used to that and would normally have let it pass. But on this occasion, prompted by a public letter of protest from the redoubtable Frank Morehouse, zealous about authors' rights, I wrote back and pointed out that artists, like publishers, often very well paid, and printers and booksellers should be paid for their work. In her reply, the publisher explained that one of the reasons why they hadn't offered any of the contributors' payment was that, and here I quote, "The size of what we might offer could be seen," I like that phrase, "could be seen as insulting," unquote. That is, the copyright fee that they might have offered was clearly so derisory that they deemed it less insulting, less embarrassing, to offer the artist nothing instead, rather than a pittance. Nothing in this case was honourable. Nothing in this case had a kind of blank cachet. Nothing was almost charismatic. This is surely impressive logic, but then artists are used to such treatment, and many artists, regrettably, will put up with it for the sake of publication. This is how some publishers rationalise their low fees. I know. I was an academic myself once. I was part of that system. At times, I'm with Emily Dickinson. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing. In the parcel be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. On that occasion, I chose not to put up with it. I pass, I said. I wrote to them and politely declined to appear in the anthology. Swayed by various protests, the publisher reviewed her decision and offered me a fee of $40. Let me tell you, $40 has a very familiar ring to poets. But the point had been made and a principle had been observed. Apart from the intrinsic unfairness of this lamentable culture, I worry about the implications for our literary culture. Worry as an editor and also as a fellow writer. Here I am referring to the kind of stylish independent literary journalism that my magazine and like publications try to present. The fruit of close reading, a lifetime's erudition, several weeks of attention to the text, flair, wit, provocativeness, and all those other qualities we look for in critics. There are other kinds of reviews, of course, short, punchy, promotional, utilitarian ones, but I'm talking about a different kind of journalism and one that takes longer if done well. Over the years, some major young critics, the ones who will guarantee the health of our critical culture in coming decades, have talked to me quite openly about possibly having to give up reviewing and pursue other vocations simply because they can't afford to go on doing it. Audaciously, they might have children to educate. Outrageously, they might dream of owning a house one day. They might like to go on holidays occasionally. I think too, and worry too, about the over-reliance on unpaid internships, where bright young things, editors of the future, spend several months with organisations full-time and fully unpaid. We risk going down that exploitative American path here. Now, I should say that the magazine that I edit takes in voluntary volunteers for part of a day a week, for if they want to spend that with us over a few months, or longer. We also offer the only fully paid editorial internship that I'm aware of. Let me ask this. What other profession holds that the most effective way to foster talent, to advance young careers, and to retain loyalty is by withholding payment for the first few years? Law doesn't do it. Medicine doesn't do it. Government doesn't do it. Organised sport certainly doesn't do it. I think the present situation is shaming and close to abusive. So what's to be done? I think the time has come for all of us to become better literary citizens, more engaged, more informed, more generous-hearted, more giving. We're all involved, publishers, consumers, and writers. We all have responsibilities. For its part, Australian Book Review has recently committed itself to doubling our base rate as soon as possible. We will do so incrementally as soon as we can, and we will make that clear. Before I leave Australian Book Review, and rest assured I do not intend to do a Robert Silvers, I hope our base rate will be $1 a word. And bear in mind, we publish 60,000 words a month, 600,000 words a year in our 10 issues. We can all do our sums. That's big money for a small magazine without an endowment or a wealthy owner, but it's rightly ambitious and it's only responsible. ABR poetry editor Lisa Gorton and I look forward to the day when we will pay poets $500 per poem, rather than the current $250. And that day won't be far off. ABR also offers lucrative prizes and writers' fellowships, none worth less than $5,000. They too will increase. The time has come for writers too, I think, to become more assertive, less polite. I think the first question young writers should ask editors like me should be about payment, and they should walk out the door if they are being insulted or exploited. It is time for publishers to address non or low payments and to rethink base rates that in some cases have not changed in 10 or 20 years, or in fact may have declined. But it is also time for readers of means to support publications that support Australian writers. Subscribe to the magazines, and if you have the means, support the philanthropic programs that enable them to broaden their programs and help writers, as we do at ABR through our Patrons program, which has transformed this magazine since 2010 and will continue to do so. In closing, the situation, to my mind, is urgent, the challenge is stark, the risks considerable. If we don't do something to correct this neglect and reverse the low and non-payment and ultimate alienation of superior young critical voices, we will end up with a Mickey Mouse culture, with an overdependence on fine and not so fine publications from London and New York. We will end up with reviews that parrot publicists and do nothing for cultural literacy. In doing so, we will have endorsed that stubborn old Philistine notion that literature is a luxury and sophisticated criticism a hobby unworthy of professional support and decent remuneration. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Our final speaker in this panel is Geordie Williamson. Geordie is Chief Literary Critic of The Australian, a position that he's held since 2008. And his essays and reviews have appeared in newspapers and magazines here and in the UK for over a decade. And in 2011, he won the Pascal Prize for Criticism. Yes, we've given you 5 Pascal Prize winners this afternoon. Over to you, Geordie.
Thanks, Mel. Let me be the last, but it really has been a special day, and it's been great. For those of you who don't know about the critical community, we get together, well, this is the first time. So we're just all very excited to be amongst our own kind. I'm reminded of Pascal's vision of the human race, huddled in a corner while every so often one is dragged away to be slaughtered in front of their eyes, and I alone have lived to tell thee. So luckily for me, my provocation has hardly anything to do with literary criticism or reviewing more generally, although it does come into it. I'm reminded in relation to Ditch the Pitch that the first person who ever gave me the job, and he did so the proper way, was Peter Rose from the ABR, and I even remember where I was standing behind the giant chandelier in the State Theatre waiting to go in and see a movie at the film festival. And that was a long time ago now, and I'm very grateful for it. Now there's a mode of approach to certain subjects which I think of, and I hate to actually report my mental thought processes to you, but I think of as straining at the apocalyptic stool. And when you think when you think of figures like Theodor Adorno in philosophy, or George Steiner in literary criticism, the novels of Martin Amis, Jonathan Franzen's most recent essay for The New Yorker, you'll get a sense of what I mean. There's a sense of taking on these vast subjects and managing by your seriousness to make them into something slightly ridiculous. So I want to talk about climate change and reviewing culture. It's a long bow to draw, but since everything else has been covered, we'll be fine. The cruelest sentence of 19th century literature comes in the final chapters of Madame Bovary, when our eponymous heroine, deep in debt and abandoned by her lover, is lurching through fields at dusk towards the house where she will kill herself. In this moment of realization that all is lost, when Emma feels the ground turn to ocean beneath her and her every thought explodes into fireworks, Gustave Flaubert furnishes a single line. Night was falling. Some birds flew overhead. It's the birds that do it, that terrible avian indifference. Flaubert sends them winging because he wants the reader to understand that one woman's fall, however acutely and eloquently rendered, means nothing to nature. The planet will continue to turn as it has always done. But when I read Cormac McCarthy's The Road in 2006, I realized there was something more terrible still. The idea that there may be no birds at all. The background silence of that novel has remained with me. It's the soundtrack of a future without light or heat, without food or fuel, without society and its necessary laws, without the immemorial fraternity of animals, without a future or hope of one. If you're wondering why reading literature should be considered an ecological act, The Road is a clarifying text. For though that work is coy about the actual nature of the cataclysm that kills the trees and it leads to the extinction of animals, it's presumably an accurate portrait of a world, of a society attempting to inhabit a world that has grown unamenable to human existence. I won't eat into time by restating the science that insists we're on a fairly similar track for mass extinctions and inevitable societal breakdown. I'm really leaving us on a high note, I know. I will simply say that IMHO, the rescue of the biosphere, requires all our shoulders to the wheel. It demands that we make questions of planetary health the central concern of our politics and even our aesthetics. And if Jane Gleason White, in her recent wonderful books, can make an argument that accountants can save the world, those creators and adjudicators of value in the economic realm, then surely we, as critics and reviewers, as creators of value in the aesthetic realm, in the literary realm, can do something ourselves. Right now, any discussion of rights or political recalibrations of the public realm, irregardless of their judiciousness or worthiness and intent, strike me as a bit of pissing in the wind when you realise that biology trumps culture. And I really feel, as a reader who is obliged to wade through scores of novels each year, that the background noise of climate change, it is now the world hum, as DeLillo would have it. And all of our human dramas play out against its backdrop. When I first set out to write about literature and climate change in an essay for the Australian Literary Review in 2006, I can write about climate change in the Australian because nobody actually notices what the back half of the paper does. Don't tell anybody. It seemed that the subject was hardly dealt with in contemporary literature. Now, everyone's at it with varying degrees of aesthetic gorgeousness, rhetorical suasion, or intellectual acuity. Yet those of us charged with testing these texts, with apportioning value and forming new constellations of canonicity, are mostly still operating within a carbon-based bubble. We will review an essay from deep inside the whale. Partly, this is because the problem of climate change is, in the words of the experts, wicked, an issue that presents great scientific and economic complexity, some very deep uncertainties, profound ethical issues, and even lack of agreement on the very nature of the issues we face. It is a problem that presents differently to ecologists, economists, philosophers, and farmers, and its omnipresence can become a daunting kind of invisibility in which the best we can do is soldier on, pretending it's not happening at all. I think it's also something to do with the inbred humility of our tribe, us book reviewers, our fear of seeming foolish, of exceeding our narrow remit. I refer you to the apocalyptic strainers. There is, though, another way. The essayist and farmer poet Wendell Berry has described eating as an agricultural act. What he means by this is that we have become passive and incurious consumers of the food on our plates. He writes that, and I quote, "The industrial eater is in fact one who does not know that eating is an agricultural act, who no longer knows or imagines the connections between eating and the land, and is therefore necessarily passive and uncritical. In short, a victim. When food in the minds of eaters is no longer associated with farming and with the land, then the eaters are suffering a kind of cultural amnesia that is misleading and dangerous." I'd like to try and extend this idea to literature. We readers have also become passive consumers of the stuff. The books we praise or condemn are artifacts of an industrial system run by an oligopoly of corporate monoliths, admittedly with a few organic producers working heroically at the edges, whose profits rely on mass production, heavy marketing, and the division of readers into pre-packaged audiences, consumers of chick lit or literary fiction, speculative tales, or crime procedurals. The result has been a vast monoculture which offers the illusion of choice. 1,000 new titles linked by jacket designers' seasonal colour palettes. With significant and honourable exceptions, it produces books designed for mass consumption and easy absorption. They are product tested, designed by algorithm, and ultimately bland as white bread. An ecologically literate criticism would, like the food or wine critic who seeks out and hymns alternative producers, reject the totalising forces at work here. It would make a fuss about terroir, about place-bound writings that express something of the flavour of landscape and geology and the climate of a particular region, as well as the people and the communities who grow up into it or make it their home by choice or necessity. An ecologically literate criticism would eschew artificial genre divisions and seek out works of genuine radicalism and originality. It would apportion merit based on the degree to which a text successfully addresses, whether directly or obliquely, the unique conditions under which we live today. And it would recall us to the sense of wildness, of danger, that undergirds any true storytelling urge. In the little paddock where I till my row, the category formerly known as literature, we call this ersatz version of creative endeavour I just outlined the neoliberal novel. We all know it when we see it, the kind of book in which more socially conscious deck chairs are arranged on the Titanic. And as someone who's always been a sucker for a well-turned sentence, I must admit that those who have called these books merely lulling have a point. We must look elsewhere. I'm acutely conscious as I speak that my situation and my practices tend to mirror the phenomena I'm critiquing. I work as a jobbing book reviewer for one of those corporate monoliths. I too tread the same mill, damning with faint praise that endless stream of books to make a living. I've taken to putting lists of new words on the back door of my loo to keep the hackneyed phrases at bay for another week, I hope. But it was actually this growing sense that I was rat running that shunted me out of this mindset that I was basically enthralled to the publishing royal, and I took the chance to write a book called The Burning Library, which was a series of kind of acts of retrospective literary appreciation of figures who I considered had been sort of left out of the story of Auslit. And that was liberating for me. I stepped out of a time frame that had been set for me by somebody else and into my own. It reminded me that the amazing thing about good books is they survive. They don't require to be utterly contemporary, or, to be more fair, they remain utterly contemporary even after many years. And it's that aspect of their survival over time to which we append these kind of rather loose tags like classic. But what my adventures in not writing weekly did for me was to allow me the possibility of different critical approaches. In the context of Auslit, admittedly contested and an inherently unstable category, this has led me to a sense in which realism or naturalism or any of the other collective efforts to reproduce the world as it really is that we inherited from earlier European and Anglosphere literatures was brought into question by a concentration on my local context. So let's think about a book like Voss and that bizarre spiritual telegraph that's opened between, you know, our great explorer and Laura back in Sydney. And think of what would happen if that novel was set in 19th century England, in Barsetshire, in Trollope's world. Well, you would have a dense, closely packed and populated set of towns and regional centres and villages. You would have open lines of transport, and you would have a mail coach. Laura and Voss could have just battered those letters back and forth. But the exigencies of the Australian landscape weirded it out. And we all know about White's grotesquerie. Just get Ivor Indyk going on blue skin and green skin in Patrick White's work. Here's a thesis for you. So I think about the grotesquerie of Patrick White, the ontological instability of David Malouf, in which, you know, these characters seem to be disappearing into nature and liking it. And that seems to me to be running against the grain that everything we know about the creation of the self as a discrete and separate artifact, which is, you know, the Western course of things. And I think about the sheer ferality, if that is a word, of someone like Alexis Wright. Any ecologically inflected reading of Australian literature leads us to the understanding that our narratives are shaped by the ground beneath our feet, not the words we impose upon the landscape. I'd argue at this point that the history of our literature is the history of overcoming of a perceptual trauma, for those of us, at least, who are incomers, to a land whose strangeness and difference was such that the old imported place terms, the old stories, could not gain purchase or else spread furiously and overran their original semantic or narrative bounds. We say it with a kind of continual amazedness, but we're one of the 20 most urbanised nations on earth. And if you take out the cheats like Singapore and Vatican City, we're in the top 10. And this in a country the size of the United States of America. It beggars the imagination. The argument that I tried to mount in the Burning Library was that we've actually beaten a retreat from the inland. And this is not just a matter of kind of a smeary sense that we don't go there anymore. It's an actual phenomenon of the decline of small-scale farming and the concomitant rise of large-scale agribusiness concerns. It's about the increasing marginalisation of remote indigenous communities. It's about a whole lot of things. But this isn't just a physical or a demographic retreat to the coast. This is a retreat from story itself, from the kind of narratives we tell about ourselves as a culture. Now, what I've come to understand is that there is now a fairly clear, sorry, this is the provoking part, so I apologise everyone, a fairly clear sense that narratives about non-urban Australia are essentially masculinist, dusty, old-fashioned, reactionary, and so on and so forth. That they have nothing to say to us here now. I've heard it so many times. And as somebody who grew up at the arse end of central western New South Wales and lit out for the city as soon as I was able, I have great sympathy for that position. And yet, I don't think it's true. The bush is not only the exclusively homosocial arena of emotionally stunted men. It is the harsh crucible of Australian feminism, the world described in the stories of Olga Masters and Miles Franklin and Louisa Lawson. And it's not only the preserve of gentlemen graziers, but the kind of itinerant labourers and smallholders whose folk tales were taken up and codified in the 19th century and provided the uniquely proletarian underpinnings of our national literature. It was not always the white Australia of 20th century racial exceptionalism. It was a place where Irish, Scots and English met and mingled with Afghan camel traders, Chinese market gardeners, Japanese pearlers, Greek shop owners, Californian gold panners and so on. Just read Claire White's description of the kind of breakdown of the Eureka Stockade era Bendigo and you'll know it's a muddy melting pot. And most importantly, it is the home of many indigenous nations, many of whom, because they inhabit the kind of lands we consider either marginal or wild or waste, have maintained an unbroken tradition across hundreds of centuries of relation to the land. And I think even now we're only just coming to terms with how closely story, map, art and ecological knowledge are intertwined with place in indigenous culture. So I will conclude by saying that I feel that the task of the critic is to revivify our interest in and respect for the kinds of stories that issue from rural and remote Australia. They remind us that Australia has been peopled in different ways, that it is not and has never been a vacancy to be abandoned to those who would enclose, exploit or despoil it, confident that the rest of us are looking the other way.
Thank you, Jodie. I'm afraid we've run 20 minutes over time, but I think you'll agree that it was worth hearing the provocations in their full. So would you give our panellists up here a round of applause? And if you could make a very sprightly exit, I would be most appreciative.